The Church becomes a very horizontal phenomenon when Christ is truly present in the Eucharist. The Vatican's declaration was unexpected, even among the cardinals closest to the Curia. The Holy See press office sent out a notice 5 minutes before noon Rome time, but it was so short and subtle that many people thought it was a mistake. Robert Cardinal Sarah has been assigned to a newly established office within the Holy See by His Holiness Pope Leo I, 14th. There will be more details presented later. There is no description or title. A press conference is not being held, but the Catholic world was on fire in 5 minutes. The Guinean-born prelate, Cardinal Sarah, was well known for his ardent support of orthodoxy. The man who subtly but clearly differed with Pope Francis on a wide range of issues, including gender ideology and liturgical reform. The guy who many believed had been marginalized during the previous pope has departed to deliver homilies in Dar and lectures in Paris. Instead of being silenced, he was now being called back. Ceremonial retirement doesn't appeal to me. We are, however, going on to something fresh and dynamic. Sarah had been the flag bearer for the most conservative part of the Church for years, a hero to those who wanted theological clarity, Latin masses, and unwavering dogma. Additionally, he was a target of progressive criticism, with some charges of exclusion, rigidity, and nostalgia masquerading as holiness leveled at him. Nevertheless, he was reinstated by Pope Leo I, 14th. Why? Why would a new pope, who is already well known for his amiable manner, reformist views, and emphasis on inclusivity, go for a man who is often depicted as his complete opposite? Theories proliferate. Was this an effort to curry favor with the Church's conservative faction? Was Leo trying to balance the voices of the global South with his role as Pope? Or was there a more profound cause, a calculated action that suggested redefinition instead of compromise? Regardless of the answer, there was no doubt about that. The exile had ended for Cardinal Robert Sarah. He had returned. What about the role he had been given by Pope Leo? There was no honorific. It wasn't a metaphor. It was crucial to the mission, because Leo XIV seems to realize what his predecessors often forgot. Even as the world argues dogma and direction, the future can be shaped by those who oppose change. The scene is set for a church characterized by contrast rather than conflict. With Sarah's return, Cardinal Robert Sarah stood for something the Vatican didn't fully comprehend: unwavering conviction for almost 10 years. From her nomination by Pope Benedict XVI to Pope Francis's early years in office, Sarah's ascent was swift. He stood out in Rome because to his African heritage, artistic way of living, and solid theological beliefs, but he also became a liability over time. He resigned from his position as the congregation's prefect for sacramental discipline and divine worship by 2021. According to the Vatican, he had attained the retirement age of 75, which is the norm for curial heads and bishops. Everyone in the Curia, however, was aware of this. According to a former Vatican official, he was sidelined. It is too obvious, too ingrained, and too unwavering. Sarah's disagreements with Francis's plan were never made public. He never yelled at anyone or chastised them in public, but his writing was incisive, poetic, and unrepentant, and it was evident what he thought. He was against remarried and divorced people receiving communion. He claimed that the relaxation of liturgical conventions was spiritual deformity and objected to it. He stood out for clerical celibacy when others contended that it was no longer required. In favor of societal relevance, he cautioned frequently that the Church was losing its sense of the sacred. Many people saw his 2019 book, The Day Is Now Far Spent, as a covert critique of the Vatican's leadership. Without a single contemporary Vatican official endorsing it, it sold more than 200 copies in several languages. He changed into something of a ghost in Rome. He was often spotted kneeling in silent prayer at masses while wearing his scarlet cassock. He gave talks all across Africa and Europe. He visited marginal parishes, but the calls from Vatican ministries ceased to arrive. He wasn't asked to talk. According to a French Mancier, he was not asked to offer advice. But when he spoke, the pews were packed. Everyone wanted to hear his thoughts. Sarah, however, never played the victim. He refused to specifically attack Pope Francis in interviews. His response to the question of his removal was simply, "I serve wherever God places me." Some thought he was done, a throwback, a remnant, the final vestige of the Benedict 16th century. Others, however, were more aware. According to a bishop from Senegal, Silence does not imply submission. We in Africa understand the value of patience. He then waited. Sarah kept on praying, reading, serving, and observing as he usually did while the church disputed synods and comments. He observed Francis's latter years, which were characterized by scandal, internal strife, and a growingly polarized flock. He saw the voices get louder, more furious, and less receptive on both sides. He saw young seminarians return to their covert Latin studies after becoming disillusioned by ambiguity. When Pope Francis passed away and the conclave doors closed, Sarah was there, not angling, not campaigning, just being there. Some people thought he had little chance of winning the popeship. He was hardline and too provocative. That might not have been his responsibility, though, as the impossible happened a few weeks later under a different pontificate. The phone rang. It came silently. No announcement, no entourage. It's a straightforward call. At Cardinal Robert Sarah's humble home on the outskirts of Rome, where he had resided since retirement, the telephone rang. African iconography, well-worn theological literature, and the quiet of a man who had stopped expecting much from Vatican phone calls filled the tiny stone cottage. However, it rang that morning. He replied, Pope Leo XIV on the opposite end. The voice said, Robert, calm and familiar. Let's have a conversation. 43 minutes passed throughout the call. Sources claim that this was neither a demand nor a summons. It was a request. Pope Leo is said to have said, I have been listening to the church, and I think that if we don't include people who felt excluded, we can't create unity. At first, Sarah said nothing. He had no delusions. He understood politics. One year, he had witnessed men applaud, and the next, they erased. However, this was unflattering. This was straightforward and truthful. The new pope commended Sarah's bravery, lucidity, and above all, his testimony. As Leo XIV told him, you stood your ground, Sarah gasped. Now I need you to walk with me, not in the past, but into the future. Raised in Francis's spirit, this pope was widely recognized as a bridger and a centrist reformer who was also keenly conscious of the widening rift within the church. Why get in touch with the individual who is most closely linked to the opposition? It was then that Leo explained. He said, I'm not trying to silence you. I want you to be yourself and serve in a visible way. Then came the chance to run a new office that prioritizes global renewal over internal bureaucracy, rather than going back to liturgical monitoring or being buried in an advisory role. Sarah asked for some time to pray. Leo claimed he had no lower expectations. For 5 days, Sarah followed his routine, which included going to Mass by herself, reading the Bible, and taking walks in the garden outside his home. He didn't talk to any journalists. We didn't interview anyone. But according to insiders, they noticed something in his face that they hadn't noticed in years. Calm, because he was not asked to altar by the Pope. He wanted him to serve once more, but on a mission that was more like a calling than an assignment. Cardinal Sarah concurred 5 days later. I've never sought titles, but if this benefits the church, I will walk. That's how it happened, without any restrictions or exceptions. Now, the fiery theologian, the polarizing cardinal, the so-called exile, was discreetly getting ready for a post that would carry him farther than any curia office had ever gone into a shattered church that sorely needed someone to remind it of what humility wrapped around conviction. The Vatican did not bury the complete declaration in unclear language or liturgical jargon when it was ultimately released. It was audacious, unambiguous, and unusual for many in Rome. In order to deepen relationships between traditional Catholic communities and the core mission of unity, evangelism, and doctrinal faithfulness, His Holiness Pope Leo XIV designates his distinguished colleague, Robert Cardinal Sarah, as his special papal ambassador to the global South. There has never been a job like that. No guidebook, precedent, or prior holder existed. It had been created especially for Sarah by Pope Leo XIV. Vatican correspondents were frantically trying to figure out what it meant within hours. Is it an act of goodwill, a concession to conservatives, or something more? Because the authority it imparted was quite real, despite the title's ceremonial appearance. According to insiders, the Secretary of State would not get a report from Sarah. He would answer to the Pope directly. Among his directives were the following: traveling through Africa, Asia, and Latin America to negotiate episcopal appointments on behalf of the Vatican, advising bishops' conferences on the relationship between modern pastoral care and liturgical tradition, acting as a point of contact for areas facing growing internal division, persecution, and secularism. Reintegrating marginalized traditional Catholic communities into the Church's worldwide mission is of utmost importance. Cardinal Sarah, to put it briefly, was not being kept in a museum. They were sending him to the front. Nobody had anticipated it. The move caused astonishment and even bewilderment within the Curia, but not everyone was pessimistic. According to one Vatican official, it's as if the Pope reached into the past to build the future. As he read the memo, a young Nigerian priest who works in the Congregation for Bishops grinned. He said, "This is not politics, it's intimate." Leo knows Sarah speaks the language of growth and can see where the faith is developing. The data do not lie, in fact. The world's fastest growing Catholicism over the past 20 years has been in the global south, especially in sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia. Instead of marketing strategies, the Church's growth there is being driven by martyrs, missionaries, and movements. However, many of these areas feel isolated from Rome and alienated by discussions about gender, codality, and liturgical experimentation that are centered on the West. Sarah exemplifies a unique combination of Roman orthodoxy and African spirituality, steadfast faith, and a thorough understanding of the struggling Church. Outside of Europe, the response was instantaneous. At the street, Charles Langa Cathedral in Kinshasa, bells rung. Even Sarah's detractors took notice when Filipino seminarians in Cebu tweeted her, quote, "The West is dying because it has forgotten how to kneel. Whether you like him or not, you have to deal with him now." A Jesuit theologian who had previously argued with him at a liturgical conference stated in a blog post, "There is no hoopla, no press event, just these words. I'll go wherever the Church sends me, and I will not talk of ideology, but of the gospel." Sarah accepted the position in a brief letter once she returned to Rome. The Pope chose engagement over exile, which explains everything. The Vatican is accustomed to internal tremors, but few recent appointments have sent such clear and polarizing shockwaves through its corridors as Cardinal Robert Sarah's return. The man who was once branded as being too rigid for modern Catholicism was sent to walk ahead of the past rather than defend it. The reaction behind the walls of the Vatican came in waves: surprise, skepticism, and then a gradually rising realization that this is more than just a gesture. This is strategy. Some people view it as the first mistake of Pope Leo XIV's young pontificate, while others see it as his most audacious to date. "This man wanted to restore the Latin Mass everywhere," moaned a senior official with intimate ties to the Francis administration. "Are we giving him more authority now? It's not about empowering him. It's about listening to what half of the Church has been saying and giving them a voice that won't destroy the house," disputed another junior official speaking on background. The Vatican press corps coverage was equally divided, with progressive Catholic publications running op-ed pieces warning of creeping restorationism and the rehabilitation of hardliners. In fact, Pope Leo XIV had not appointed Sarah as head of a curial department, nor had he placed him in charge of liturgy or doctrine, but instead had given him something more dangerous: a voice and a mission outside the bureaucracy. The most popular image on Catholic Twitter showed Pope Leo XIV in white, smiling softly, and Cardinal Sarah in red, eyes down, holding a breviary. The caption read, "There are two pillars, one church." Some Vatican watchers were concerned that this would lead to a new ideological conflict, Francis versus Benedict. But this time, it was Leo versus Sarah. One headline read, "The Return of Rigor." Traditionalist platforms, however, erupted in celebration. "He's not building camps," one Curia employee said, "but he is building corridors between voices that had forgotten how to communicate with one another." In fact, the Pope reportedly told his advisors, "If you silence every voice that questions you, you will end up alone, and alone is not a place for Peter's successor." Insiders, however, claimed that Leo expected and welcomed the tension, and Cardinal Sarah, he made no disparaging remarks. "There is no press conference." When asked by a journalist whether he saw his role as a comeback, he responded, "This is not a return. Never have I left. All I was doing was praying." Even his critics were surprised by his tough yet non-flaming tone. "Now I am walking," because he was being brought back as a witness, not to fight. Regardless of his prior disagreements with Francis's agenda, and in a Vatican more used to cautious messaging and subtle maneuvering, the clarity of Leo's move said more than any encyclical. The Church cannot be whole if it amputates her prophets. It was a quick press conference inside the Archbishop's home in Nairobi, not Rome. There were no velvet curtains, no gold-trimmed thrones, a long table, a few microphones, and Cardinal Robert Sarah, who sat silently until the cameras stopped recording. He had no political smile or spectacles on, just a red mosetta and a rosary around his fingers. Then he spoke, not with fire, but with finality. I serve, I don't seek. It was those 6 words that silenced a whole news cycle, with no reference to conflict, rival factions, or liturgical wars. And Cardinal Sarah simply responded, "I'm not here to debate history," when asked directly about his past conflicts with Vatican leadership. The highlight of the event was when a Kenyan reporter asked him, "What is your message to Catholics who are torn between tradition and change?" "I'm here to bring Christ to the poor, broken, and faithful who feel forgotten." He also confirmed his new title as Special Papal Envoy to the Global South and revealed his upcoming itinerary, which includes South Sudan, Burkina Faso, Colombia, the Philippines, and a return to Europe to listen, not to lecture. Sarah didn't recoil. Truth is constant, but every generation needs a different strategy to win people over. Some call me inflexible, but I see myself as rooted, and I don't mind change as long as it comes from prayer. I fear change brought on by panic. Another journalist asked him what he thought about the rumors that he was a checkmate move by Leo IV to please the conservative base. He thanked the Pope for his trust, praised his African brethren for their testimony, and closed with words that reverberated well beyond Nairobi. "We aren't supposed to be left or right." Sarah responded with a long, measured smile. "A bishop isn't just a piece on the board, he serves souls. I go where the shepherd sends me, to find the sheep who have given up believing anyone is coming." He got up, refused to shake hands, and walked out on his own, not with headlines following him but with gravity. "We are supposed to be holy. If I speak, it will not be for applause. If I walk, it is not to gain power." Pope Leo XIV did not merely revive a dormant prelate when he appointed Cardinal Sarah as special envoy to the Global South. Whether the world loves him or hates him, Cardinal Sarah had returned, not to reclaim a platform but to lift a cross. This was dubbed a masterstroke in Rome, not because it was ostentatious or expected, but because it changed the center of gravity without firing a single shot. He altered the conditions of participation in the Church. Pope Leo has now stated, "No, you can be both Francis and Benedict, progressive or traditional, compassionate or dogmatic." For the past 10 years, Catholicism has been engulfed in a false dichotomy. You have to be both. The voices that used to be on the other side of the aisle must now move in unison if this church is to be healed. Cardinal Sarah was called to serve in the mission fields rather than Rome by Leo XIV, who did something radical by assigning tradition a task rather than a throne, not making him the guardian of doctrine or liturgy, and not using him against progressives. Instead, he sent him to the place where the church is expanding the fastest and breaking the deepest, with the directive to unite rather than rebuke. In the words of one Vatican observer, Francis showed the world compassion, Benedict stood up for the truth, Leo is trying to marry them, and now Sarah is part of that union. This does not mean that the church is no longer divided. It is not a miraculous healing, but it is a sign from the top that the old walls are collapsing. And for a church beaten by scandal, ideology, and attrition, that message might be the first sign of something it hasn't felt in years: hope. Because if Cardinal Robert Sarah can find his place again, not in opposition but in mission, then maybe the church can too, but not by tearing them up, by inviting both builders and critics to rebuild together.